So I took some tears off my eyes and I put it on his forehead.
Listening to Let Your Voice Be Heard.
It's a logical fallacy, and I know that, but, as always, and maybe the rest of the panel can tell you, I play a bit of the devil's advocate because I am the lone black Republican up here.
He just made a fool out of himself. I mean, you can look at Dennis Rodman and think he's making a fool out of himself.
We know Barack Obama, what he was like, anti-war, government...
Boy, that escalated quickly.
I got to jump into a rally to save a hospital here in Brooklyn in just a minute.
I stopped working on my dissertation the second my grandmother died.
I am a blazing liberal who can have a Republican-leaning ideology if you give me enough beers.
I got to get you that Illuminati thesaurus. Once you get that, you're going to be able to speak in the same language I can speak.
Now, a white person with a criminal record is more likely to get a job than a black person without one.
What? Did we just become best friends? Yep!
The point of financial stability and economic justice is that you're free from confines of society and you have more freedom and to make your own choices.
Just in general, people who have money tend to have more access to resources to be able to use in their defense versus people that don't have money. So you see a lot of, lower, and that's really a class issue, and race does come into play.
This is Let Your Voice Be Heard, right here on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem.
And we are back on Let Your Voice Be Heard on 90.3 FM WHCR, the voice of Harlem. I want you guys to know I've been drinking Henny since the 3rd grade.
Really?
No. What is wrong with you? Why would I be drinking Hennessy?
It's supposed to be the 5th grade, Stanley.
So who sells crack at 5th grade? It doesn't make it okay.
I didn't say it's okay, but I really feel his pain and struggle when I hear that line.
No, you don't.
Yes,
I feel that he
do.
doesn't know how to read. That's what I feel.
You know what? We're not going to talk about Bobby Schmurder. He did some time, and now he's doing something very progressive in his life.
Who brags about being a murderer except for serial killers?
I can't defend him there. I can't.
But that beat is hot though, and that's all that's
all that matters.
He's like, I kill people for a living. All my drug dealer murderer friends should get out of prison. And we're all like, yeah,
I know, right?
Free the killers, because the beat is hot.
I mean, that's pretty much what it is.
That's pretty much what it is.
I can't act like I don't do the shmoney dance.
The shmoney dance is real when you see white people shmoney dancing at rave parties. When you see,
do they do that?
When you see Sunflower and Willow doing a shmoney dance, instead of dancing the Summertime Sadness, that's how you know it's real. It's also called cultural appropriation. They're Columbusing all over Bobby Schmurder's record label.
This is a widespread song and phenomenon, just like Criming While White.
How many white kids you know been selling crack since like the 5th grade?
I can't attest to that. I don't know.
I know. As someone who knows white people, I will tell you that's not what they do, all right?
They aren't selling crack.
No, they cook meth in trailer parks.
I've been cooking meth since like the 3rd season. But anyways, guys, the reason I'm talking about white people like this is because we're switching gears, and now we are going to our segment, Criming While White. In case you're wondering what the hell Criming While White means, it is a hashtag that became popular after one of the producers on the Jimmy Fallon show tweeted out a crime that he committed when he was younger that he did not get arrested for, using the hashtag Criming While White. And he did this on the day that Eric Garner, the cop that choked Eric Garner to death, was not indicted, even though Eric Garner's murder went viral. He was not indicted, and people were very confused because unlike the Mike Brown situation, there was video footage. Everyone saw it. The chokehold was illegal. The autopsy was very clear in saying that the chokehold and the blunt force to his chest is what led to his death, even though the NYPD will let you know it's McDonald's and asthma. It was not. And then white people all over the world in the interweb started sharing their stories. One of my favorite Criming While White stories, which is not actually on Twitter, was the one about the young man who drunk drove, took drugs, and ran over 4 people, killing 2 of them, I think. And when he went to court, his family was so rich, they had a lawyer who said that he's so rich he doesn't understand right from wrong.
Well, that's the affluenza case.
Yes.
We talked about that one time.
Yes,
if you're interested, you should check out our archive shows.
Yeah. Listen, you know how I throw it back real good. That's right, girl. I see you. You're real MVP. So that was one of my favorite cases of Criming While White. We've had other cases in which someone tweeted that they stole a car and had a car for 4 days before they were caught by the cops, and the police didn't arrest them. They just took the car back.
I was reading one where a guy says that he gets pulled over and he had open liquor in the car. He had literally had the bottle and it was open and it was in his hand and he smelled like booze. And the cop was just like, yeah, call somebody to pick you up.
Right. But what I think is more significant about this hashtag, and, there's definitely been a lot of accolades for it and definitely a lot of criticism that we'll get to and are completely legitimate, is that it really started off as sort of a gentle way of people saying, yeah, this one time, I was stopped for this thing and it was totally let go, and the cops really didn't give me a hard time about it. It wasn't even these heightened crimes that are, even felonies that we're hearing about now. But it was a way of people saying, this is, I got pulled over speeding, the cop let me go. I got, caught smoking a joint in the park. The cop let me go. And it was a way of sort of saying, like, maybe this is how cops should be policing all communities, not just white ones, saying, you know, using judgment and using compassion. And, you know, it's almost the opposite of broken windows that white communities are experiencing, where in, you know, communities of color, cops come down so harshly on these smaller crimes, whereas in white communities, they're sort of let go because cops know, oh, it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
And, you know, why don't we abandon broken windows and sort of implement these tactics all over?
It's not just the policy, it's also the humanity that they see. So if they see, for example, a good friend of ours, Jackie, I won't say her name because she'll probably kill me, but if they saw her and she committed a crime, anyone who saw this person, she is the most adorable human being I know. She looks like a 10-year-old girl. And the cop
sound like a creep, but continue.
Yeah, that does sound actually creepy.
She's so adorable. She looks 10.
No Bill Cosby. So
Hashtag.
Yes, hashtag. So, and you would see her and you would think, okay, you know what, she's a kid, let her slide. But then they'll see somebody like me and they don't see that same humanity. They don't see that same innocence. Granted, I'm 6 feet, 230 pounds, and I have a beard. But still, I have
and
humanity.
You're black.
Yes, and I'm a blackly black.
That also goes back to the way that people are perceived and that age-old perception about, you know, how white people are perceived and how black, you know, like, and even the way the media sometimes defines it, or even the way Darren Wilson described Michael Brown as, I thought that this Hulk Hogan or this Hulk type guy. Meanwhile, Darren Wilson and Mike Brown are essentially the same height and close to not the same weight, but have similar weights.
What Darren Wilson described was Super Saiyan level 5 of Goku. That was not a 17-year-old black boy. But I just want to shift gears because we're talking about all these perceptions and the lack of humanity that people see and that people can't see in people of color. And the reason we're doing this is because of the hashtag CrimingWhileWhite, but also what CrimingWhileWhite means. CrimingWhileWhite is a perfect example of what our friends in this studio would like to call white privilege. Now, white privilege does not mean that because you're white, you get on a bus and they have champagne and candy for you, and that if a cop sees you and a black person, they arrest a black person and give you a treat. That's not what it means, but it does mean that there are some internal differences in the way you are treated because of the color of your skin, and it doesn't mean, and sometimes that can put you ahead. So, for example, the unemployment rate right now is 5.8% in the U.S. For African Americans, it's 14%. For African American males, it's 19%. For African American women, it's 17%. For Latino males, it is 16%. For white males, it's 5.8%. That's an example of white privilege. Or another example of that is I fell asleep on the train with my white friend, and an Asian guy sitting across from us thought I was kidnapping her because
you're black.
Well, yes, and then you know, if she had fallen asleep on me, no one would have thought that she was kidnapping me. I mean, granted, she's also smaller than me, but you see my point. So on the show today, we want to talk about white privilege, the police reaction to African Americans, and then, you know, how this all comes into play with the anger and the rage that a lot of people feel today in these protests and these conversations we're having about cultural appropriation, police brutality, racism, etc., etc. So the first thing I want to go to actually is just talking about white privilege, and because this show is usually led by the blackity black blacks topic.
What?
I don't know. I really want to say blackity black.
Did you just call us blackity blacks?
I'm blackity black. You're not blackity black.
What am I?
You're Selena.
Okay, whatever.
All right, but anyways, I'd actually want to get somebody, a non-person of color, though either Celissa or Jackie under the bus, to just explain what white privilege is, because what I tend to see is that when a black person says white privilege, the white culture goes, that's not real. So, Jackie?
Yeah, I think I saw a tweet about, after the non-indictment in Ferguson came out that summed it up really well, where this person said, you know, white people, you're angry, you're upset about this decision, you're, you know, frustrated at the system, but you're not afraid. And that's the difference between having white privilege and not, right? Is that I can go out and, you know, pass a cop and not have to feel afraid for my life. And, you know, I can be angry at them and upset, but I'm not in this immediate danger that people of color are often in, you know, especially around police officers. And that's a privilege.
Yes,
you know, it's not something I've earned by any means. It's just I was born into the system that grants me that privilege, and that's what it is.
And I look at it that way also. I mean, one, I'll answer your first question is I absolutely think it exists, and two, I think it exists.
Does exist.
Yeah, on two levels, which is you have, and both of them obviously interact with each other. You have the more grand level, the systemic issues within our institutions as a country in which black people and white people are not treated the same, and you can see that with the grand jury process. process, just as an example. And then you have the more, which comes out of the same systemic system, but then you have the more lower level thing, which is, I live on the Upper East Side, Jackie lives in Astoria. These are considered, I don't know, predominantly, although Astoria is becoming more of a minority and mixed neighborhood, whereas the Upper East Side, more of a mixed neighborhood, whereas the Upper East Side is still, I believe, to be predominantly white. And it's the idea that on the lowest level, that when I go home at night, there's not 5 police officers standing on my corner every single night. In fact, I can't even tell you the last time I saw a police officer on the Upper East Side unless he was or she was in a car that was passing me, versus if you go into a community that's predominantly made up of minorities, which the police like to use high crime neighborhood, which I hate that moniker because I feel like it's just a reason for the police to be there and police black people. You'll see, as I said, 5 cops on every corner, these big spotlights. And I know you've mentioned that to some extent, some residents find those to be effective in fighting crime, but it's just a different sort of culture at the lowest level where, I don't have to worry about being stopped by a police officer when I'm walking home at 3 a.m. on the Upper East Side. But if you were walking home at 3 a.m. in Harlem, just going back to your apartment, there's a good likelihood that you would be stopped.
Yeah, absolutely right, actually. There's been a couple of times where I've walked friends to the train station and I don't feel like getting dressed, so I'll throw on some sweatpants and a hoodie. But because I know I could be stopped, I bring my ID. Because you can be arrested without having your ID. And I was almost arrested my first week in my new apartment. I went to go throw out the garbage. And 2 cops stopped me, and they asked my ID and had me in handcuffs until one of the neighbors was like, he lives here.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But, I don't want to get, hung up on these stories. What I want to do is pinpoint some examples of white privilege using protest. So now we know that we've seen a large explosion of protests, especially with what happened in Ferguson and what's happening in New York with Eric Garner. But when people started protesting and even rioting in some cases, and that was a small group, let's be honest about that, in Ferguson, what you saw from the media, from people out there was these are animals. They're filthy. They're destroying their communities. Meanwhile, a month and a half ago, there was a huge riot in New Hampshire over a freaking pumpkin fest.
Yep.
And what they do is pretty much someone spoke to media and said, we do this every year. We come here, we flip cars, we burn stuff. It's fun. Jackie?
Yeah, no, we see this all the time. I mean, in colleges like Penn State when,
Joe Paterno?
With Joe Paterno, or even in San Francisco when the Giants won the World Series. We see white protests and riots where over, we all like sports here, but over just ridiculous things that are, where they're lighting cars on fire and, smashing windows of buildings, and nothing really seems to be done about it.
Selena?
And I just wanted to mention, when you use the words like animals and these coded language, that was a big thing.
High crime neighborhood.
High crime neighborhoods. But I just wanted to say, when you call people animals and stuff like that and thugs, and saying that these are the people that are protesting, number one, there are only a handful of people that do use this as an opportunity to cause some type of riot or to incite some type of violence. It's not it's not everyone, but the media does tend to give that overall perception, and then they call people animals when we all know it's just, in my opinion, another a word that you can use, an FCC approved word, instead of using the N-word. And I want to give everyone a chance to call in. If you guys want to let your voice be heard, the number is 212-650-6903.
Yeah, just add to that. We have a double standard in this country that is pervasive in everything. Here's a good example. So I don't know if you've read the book. If you haven't, you should get a copy of it. It's Matt Tabibi, The Divide. And it talks about our criminal justice system when it comes to the prosecution of financial crimes and white-collar crimes committed by people who work on Wall Street. And not to say there aren't people of color that work on Wall Street. There are. But the difference between how, he talks about in this new article that he released yesterday, there was more police surrounding Eric Garner on the street on the day of July 17th over potentially or allegedly selling loose cigarettes than there was surrounding Wall Street for, however long, when they were making all these bets and trading on these default credit swaps and whether or not you were going to fail on your mortgage. And he goes on to further say that because of a law about about security trading, the regular police couldn't even go down onto Wall Street and arrest anybody for doing that because they would be totally banned from. So it's also a double standard about how if you commit an egregious white-collar crime and you rob people of their future and all of their savings through the stock market, we're like, hey, here's a slap on the wrist.
Yeah,
but
don't
if you're,
do that.
But if you're out on the street, and this is even assuming that Eric Garner was in fact selling cigarettes, because there's lots of information out there that says on the day in question he was not, even though he may have in the past or had in the past. So you have a situation where you have Eric Garner literally being killed over selling, committing an offense that is so low level. But if you work on Wall Street and you screw up everybody's future, for the most part, everybody's like, we're going to give them a non-prosecution agreement. So that's the systemic version of it, about how it's in our institutions.
Thank you so much for that, Alyssa. I wanted to bring up something as well. So we know that these high-level crimes like Wall Street commit hurt more people, but the police usually put most of their pressure on these low-level crimes like selling cigarettes, even though one of our callers would say that selling cigarettes is something that actually is a high-level crime because of what it produces. And then people like Eric Garner end up being hurt. But then what we also see, besides the police focusing on people whose crime have a lower impact, there seems to be lack of appreciation for their humanity. And I want to use the example of school shootings, people who of the mass shootings. So we know that most mass shootings that we know of that are counted in America are usually done by Caucasian Americans, usually by men. Actually, I don't know of any mass shooting that happened by women. Women just have it together. But anyways, it's usually done by men. So we'll use the one for the Newtown shooting.
Right.
When after it happened, he killed himself, and there were reports coming out he was a troubled child.
Right.
His mom didn't necessarily do what she had to do. He had all these issues. And that was the direction of the story. Mike Brown didn't have a gun. There's no proof that, even though they said that he stole those cigarillos, that has never been proven. And the guy that owns the source said he didn't even call the cops on Mike Brown. But meanwhile, on my wall, actually, with someone who I thought was a friend, was saying Mike Brown was a monster. He deserved to be shot like that. That cop was doing his job. But a kid that shot 23 freaking first and second graders
was apprehended alive. I mean, these are just examples of how systemic white privilege through our institutions, as I was just mentioning before. And I know that we're going to go to break, but when we come back, we can definitely talk about some more examples of how this plays into, everyday life.
It does. It really does.
It does.
And I just wanted to mention, like Stanley talked about how you sort of internalize it. He said before he leaves his apartment building, even if it's like taking out the trash, he makes sure he has his ID because he knows that at any moment in his life, being a black man, he could be stopped, frisked, and arrested for simply walking down the street in his neighborhood. But we're going to take a quick break. We'll get back to more of this conversation right here on Let Your Voice Be Heard, and tweet us at BeHeard_radio.
Them shows is back to
I have a job. You work at
No.
Costco's? What's
Or
going on?
if you listen to the song, they work during the weekend, and that's why they party during the week.
Why? Why would you party during
Some
the week?
people don't have conventional jobs. They
No,
don't have 9 to 5.
that's actually true. I worked in the restaurant business, and we used to party during the week because we would work all weekend.
It's not just restaurants; it's also people in media, especially. They party during the week.
During the week? I'm not about that partying.
I'm
life
glad we're
anymore.
addressing this huge problem of why people were going.
Well, Stanley brought it up. That's why.
I did. Well, anyways,
we answered
guys,
the tough one.
We are back on Let Your Voice Be Heard radio on 90.3 FM WHCR, the voice of Harlem, talking about white privilege, and we were just finishing up a conversation about the Newtown shootings in Connecticut, and we have Ms. Deborah, who is back after her sparring session with Rosa Clemente, and she has a comment to make as well. So, Ms. Deborah, let your voice be heard.
Yeah, the day of the shootings, when the children were murdered, I felt terrible, like any human being should. And then when I got home, I turned on the television, and there was one of the mothers, and she said, things like this aren't supposed to happen to people like us. And I was like, who's it supposed to happen to?
Right.
Yeah.
Who is it supposed to
Right.
happen
Yeah.
to? And I noticed that there were a lot of people coming from other parts of Connecticut who were not wealthy, and they felt bad. They were standing, nearby the church or wherever they were having this memorial. And one of the guys who it appeared that he lived in the neighborhood, this woman said, "Oh, we feel so bad," and he says, "Please, please, get away. We want our privacy." I mean, just so cold. And unfortunately, they didn't understand. They were still feeling bad. I would never come back there again.
Yeah.
I would not.
Wow.
I felt really bad, and I really think that they really need to check themselves because, that's just not right.
You're right about that, Ms. Eber, thank you so much for sharing that comment. I didn't even realize they said that, but that's a very, and of course they were speaking through grief, but that's a very coded thing to say.
Right.
It's their it just shows their mentality and what they think is supposed to happen and who it's supposed to happen to. But I also think class plays an issue because that was an upper middle class neighborhood.
Yeah.
And they did equate that to, this person had a mental illness. Meanwhile, the psychological issues that go on in Black and brown communities that never get addressed because of the stigma and because of the lack of health insurance and a number of other issues, we never say, why don't, this person might be dealing with too much emotional trauma because they hear gunshots every night.
Alyssa,
Right.
I see you got something to say. Hit
Oh,
us.
and in some weird way, I really wanted to plug Obamacare there and be like, see,
Me
but
too.
Obamacare covers mental health now and allows people in lower income neighborhoods to get access to the mental health care that they wouldn't have been able to get back before. But not to get off topic, I wanted to bring it back to what we were talking about before about the difference, what white privilege is and how it manifests itself. So again, in this article that I was mentioning before, I'm just going to read you a tiny passage about it. He talks about this argument that the police are sent to where there's the most crime. And then he says, then he goes on to say that Matt Taibbi, the Rolling Stone writer, he says that argument doesn't hold up for long in a city that's not only has recently become the unpunished economic corruption capital of the Western world, it's also a place where white professionals on the Upper East and West Sides can have their coke and weed safely home delivered with their Chinese food, while minorities in Bed-Stuy and Harlem are catching real charges and jail time for the same thing. And he's absolutely right. And that's another example of how white privilege manifests itself. Whereas if you, and this also, as Selena mentioned, class works into this, because it's the intersection between class and race, but there's some truth to that. If you're white and you live on the Upper East Side and you want to get some weed, you can make a phone call, and an hour later somebody will be ringing your doorbell, delivering it to you in the comfort of your own home where there's no police officers. Where if you live 30 blocks north of there, you probably want to get some marijuana, you go out to the bodega to get it from somebody who's selling it on the street, who may get picked up for committing that crime. And that also has to do with how white privilege manifests itself.
Alyssa, telling that story probably just ticked off at least 10 of my friends from East New York, Brooklyn, who are listening right now and going, what? But I'm glad you mentioned that.
I'm telling the Matt Taibbi story. I'm not
Yeah.
saying I agree with any of those things.
I know you're not
just
saying
to clarify.
that. But what it does bring up is also some of the anger that some people of color felt about the CrimingWhileWhite hashtag. And I wanted to come back to that a little bit because, at first it was like, wow. Then after a while, it was like, whoa, wait a minute. What's happening here?
Definitely.
I know, Jackie, you had something to say about that as well?
Yeah, there's a lot of criticism surrounding the hashtag, which I totally understand, where it was a way a lot of people felt for white people to just make everything happening right now in the world about them, right? So it's like, oh, look at us and look at like the things that we can get away with, and it turned into sort of like a bragging thing where white people could brag about all the crimes and like the things that they did, and look at how like badass I am for getting away with this. But I think that what the only benefit from this hashtag was, there's still people that believe, there's still white people that believe that these these murders and these shootings of white officers against black people, of people of color are not about race. They think it's about something else, right? And so it's a good way to remind those people, no, it's definitely about race, but it's not serving, what white people are tweeting about are things that people of color are aware of, that white privilege exists, you know?
Right, but the thing is, I didn't understand that argument, like, from the black elite and the black scholars who were like, okay, stop it, white people, we get it. And I'm just like, look, don't you want people to realize that white privilege does exist? I've had people in my lives who were white and who were like, no, it doesn't. I had to argue them down for them to understand that there is a big difference in the way you're treated in the world and the way the world looks at me. So, first of all, and I saw all those people complaining and writing articles about it. I don't think anyone had a strong argument to why people should stop criming while white. I think it needs to continue. I think that it puts a spotlight on white privilege, and of course it's bringing up this conversation, and it's half the reason why we're even talking about it today. But if anyone who is black, who's a scholar, who agrees that we should stop it for some reason that I don't agree with, they can call up. The number is 212-650-6903.
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely, there's a lot of pros and cons that come along with this. And I think one of the big issues that I've seen, especially in these protests, are the way that white people have been inserting themselves into this movement in a way that's sort of overshadowing and, like, tuning out black voices, right? And so a great example of this is at some of these protests, a lot of white protesters were starting to get really rowdy and starting to flip barricades, and a lot of protesters of color were saying, okay, please don't do that, because if you're going to be, invoking a riot or, destroying police property, you're not the ones that are going to get arrested. We are, just by standing here.
And if they are, and if people do get arrested, certain people have records and they can't afford to be arrested again, or jobs.
I just wanted to touch back on a point that you were just mentioning 2 seconds ago about the people who you've had arguments about, like whether or not white privilege exists. And I think for some white people, it exists. White privilege exists so much that they are so naive that they have this thing that they don't even realize they have it, and so they say it doesn't exist because they're completely blinded to the fact that they are not stopped. Because, like, how many times have I been stopped and frisked in the past 5 years of living in the city? And I can tell you the answer to that question is 0. I have been stopped one time since I moved into New York City, and it was a subway bag stop, which is a random search, checkpoint, not hey, can I get some ID from you while you take out your garbage type of stop. And if you're white and you don't realize the fact that, like, it's the fact that you don't get stopped every other day, like that's what you consider to be normal. That's not normal for people of color that live in this city. So you have to be able to recognize that instead of being naive about it and say, yeah, there is such a thing. I don't get stopped. I've been stopped 0 times in 5 years, but my friend Stanley has been stopped 10 times in the past month. What does that tell you?
So I just want to close this out real quick, and although I have my closing statement, I want to give you guys 10 seconds to just give your final thoughts on this, starting with Selena. 1.
Oh, gosh, stop. Okay, don't even put that pressure on me. Final thoughts, I think we need to continue the conversation, but of course we need to take next steps and bring it into fruition. That means signing petitions. That means going out to marches. That means calling your legislator, local community representatives, and telling them what needs to stop. Do you want police officers to start wearing cameras? Do you want police officers to stop broken windows, stop and frisk? That's what needs to happen from this hashtag and from this conversation.
No, I agree with that. And this is something I wanted to say during the first segment and I didn't get around to, which is right now there's momentum. But you have to remember, from the time of the first bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, until the signing of the Civil Rights Act was almost 10 full years. So it's not enough to just do the protest for 5 days and then go home. You have to keep at it. And while that, that may shift, as you pointed out before, from being out in the streets every day to organizing behind closed doors and coming up with demand lists and actions, but ultimately it goes back to a combination of keeping the pressure on elected officials, which is also being done by keeping pressure on capitalist America, and essentially this idea of a shutdown, and which could eventually be a general strike, some people have talked about, but also coming up with a list of demands, as I mentioned before, about how we can better change interactions between the community and the police, and just systemically also about how our institutions have institutionalized racism that we have to figure out how to combat.
Yeah, I think, I want to lead by saying that white privilege absolutely exists. And one of the things that white people who care about what's happening in this country right now should do is acknowledge that it exists and check their privilege and, support people of color who are protesting in these movements and, be an ally and, be aware of your privilege and check it at the door.
Thank you so much for that, guys. I'm going to close it out. Selena, get your daggone camera ready. I'm about to put up a popping closing statement because I'm a man.
Here we go.
Let me stretch out my shoulders and stuff. All right, so I think for all of our listeners right here, especially who are non-people of color or white people, if you're nasty, you need to understand something. 1, privilege is real. And 2, you may feel very disgusted and frustrated about what happened, but afraid or apprehensive to comment because, as some of my friends have seen, even commenting on my Facebook page can lead to a barrage of harassment or accusations that maybe they're right about or they're wrong about. But if you really want to help and be a part of the change, there are a couple of things that you can do. And that's one, to acknowledge your privilege. And then two, don't walk around feeling sorry for it and apologizing to black people all over the place. That's not going to help anyone. What you need to do is find ways to join within the system of the people who are fighting to make change. And for the people who are fighting to make change, which means African Americans, Latin Americans, LGBT community, immigrants, women of color, we need to come together, because the civil rights movement, no matter what anyone will tell you, was not just an all-black movement. And you know what? It was led by black faces, and that's the way it should have been, and it needed to be. But there were white people there, there were women there, there were LGBT people there, and it's going to be the same exact way with this one too. There is no battle that will be won by just one small group of people. 2 people with one petition and one sign will not change the world, but 10,000 people with petitions and signs and plans and strategy and solidarity will do that. And if you're white right now and you've just come to realization of your white privilege, understand that yes, you are white and things may be different for you, but it doesn't always have to be that way. So if you want to change it, just start off by transferring some of that power to your friends of color, giving them that privilege and standing up for them. Not because you had to, because you feel guilty about slavery or whatever else you guys are feeling bad about these days, but because it's the right thing to do. Because until all of us are treated equally, we'll all be unequal and we'll be lacking power. But we got to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we got the coolest person in the world on the studio talking about all the things she's doing. This is Let Your Voice Be Heard on 90.3 FM, WHCR, the voice of Harlem.
WHCR 90.3 FM, New York. WHCR 90.3 FM, New York.